hired to come down here to Playa del Carmen on the Mayan Riviera to shoot one of the most expensive houses ever sold in the area. This is an incredible home, one of the best that will go in my portfolio. It also happens that it's also one of the most difficult. So I made sure to get Lee and Patrick on board to come down here and film this so I could show you exactly what goes on behind the scenes when I shoot one of these amazing homes. So this house is set on the coastline of the Mayan Riviera. Across the way is Cozumel and about an hour north is Cancun. Behind the house are actually legitimate Mayan ruins. It is super cool. You can go out and I can only imagine the history of things that has happened here. This house is about 13,000 square feet set right on the coastline with amazing turquoise and blue water, crystal clear blue sky. Everything about the setting is just incredible. So behind me you see these amazing tall ceilings. You see this incredible custom woodworking, the awesome furniture everywhere. The same things that make this house so beautiful also make it extremely difficult to photograph. One of the biggest and most obvious problems that I'm going to face is the insane dynamic range between the bright equatorial sun and this dark cave-like interior. And while it is beautiful, it sets us up for one hell of a time making good photograph of it. This is an actual paying job. The architect is behind the camera right now laughing at me, but we've had a hell of a time. We've been here for 3 days photographing this house, and this is a real job. These are real pictures that will be delivered to the client. So this is the third and final day that we're here. We've been shooting for the past 3 days almost non-stop. I'm going to plan to deliver about 30, 35 pictures, but we're just going to focus on 4. By this point, you should have a good idea for my workflow, but I want to teach you those really difficult situations just like this that we haven't touched on before. So the first shot that we're going to focus on is really one of the money shots of this home. It's the first thing you see when you walk in. It's that beautiful blue turquoise water, the blue sky, really intense sun, and this dark wooden interior. In order to get that to photograph well, we're going to have to do a lot of work to bring up the light levels of the interior and tame down that exterior. Now, in many cases, I might just shoot this at twilight and avoid having to light this and do all kinds of compositing to bring it out. Now, the reason we're shooting this at the height of daylight is because you need that blue sky and the harsh sun to bring out the amazing turquoise color of the water. If I waited until 5, 6, 7 o'clock at night, the water's going to reflect darkness. It's going to be a little bit too black, and I really want to drive home the fact that this is right on the beautiful Caribbean. Okay, so here we are. This is our first shot. Now, I've set the camera up at a one-point perspective. I think that's the most powerful way to capture this entire scene. And as you can see, it's so bright out there. If I show you this picture, it is just, there's like a 30-stop difference between the exterior and the interior. Now, our job is to capture this beautiful interior and the beautiful exterior, and we're going to have to do a lot of work to get there. So in order to make this photo happen, we're going to have to expose for the exterior and then bring up the interior light level using a combination of flash and ambient light. So this is actually the second time I've tried this photograph. Yesterday I tried to do the same thing with a different technique. Now, I tried to expose for the exterior and bring up the interior using an umbrella, kind of light painting all over the place. And the problem that I was having with that is even though the umbrella, it's like a 4-foot umbrella, the coverage just wasn't even enough, and there was too much fall off between where I was lighting and where I wasn't lighting. If this space was smaller and not so complicated, a single light might have worked fine. But for this, it was just too small, and even with that giant umbrella, I still couldn't get an even coverage from side to side. So by looking at these, you can tell the umbrella didn't work. I'm going to try a different approach today. We're going to set up 4 lights. We're going to start on the right-hand side, and I'm going to try to create even coverage all the way across the room. I'm going to use a little bit of CTO gel, a quarter CTO, just to warm up that light and give it a warm, woody feeling rather than a bright, white, crisp feeling. I think one of the great features of this home is that the architecture, even though it's wooden, is very warm and inviting. There's a lot of golden light coming through, so I want to keep it a little bit warm. So what we have now are 4 lights set up on this far side of the room, camera right. I don't think you can see them, but what they're doing, they're firing direct all the way across the room to light this left-hand side and bring up the exposure of the left-hand side of the room to match the exterior. Now, the reason that I didn't set them up closer and opt to use big umbrellas or anything was that I wanted to keep the fall off consistent across the room. If the lights were closer, there would be a lot more fall off, but by backing up and using more power, I can have an even light that spreads throughout the entire room, much more so than if they were much closer. Okay, so here's the base exposure where the exterior is somewhat properly exposed. It's a little bit bright, but it's more or less properly exposed. And you can see how dark it is inside. Now I'm going to turn on these lights and see what a difference it makes. So now you can see what it looks like when I have 4 lights firing all the way across the room. Let's compare that to my single umbrella yesterday. As you can see, there's much more even coverage, there's not so much fall off, and everything looks much better on this left-hand side, rather than just having a piece of things look really good as we did with the umbrella. So by using those 4 lights, like I keep driving home, I get much more even coverage and it make my life in post much easier. This is a pretty unique situation and one that I don't often encounter. It's pretty rare for me to be using 4 lights blasted bare across the room. But I think in this situation we really need it to tame this interior. So now that things look pretty good, again I have 4 flashes firing all the way across the room, lighting that left-hand side. I'm going to bracket with my aperture and shutter speed to kind of play with the mix of flash and ambient light so that I get the best looking result for this space. I might find that by letting in more flash it looks better, or letting in more ambient it looks more natural, but it's good to have those options so that when I go to post, I'm able to seamlessly composite everything together. So now that I've got the left-hand side looking good, I've fired the flash, I've bracketed flash and ambient, let's take the lights from the right-hand side and flip them over and put them on the left-hand side. All right, so we've moved our lights over to the left-hand side of the room, and I'm going to repeat the same process to light the right-hand side. I've left everything the same, power, orientation, so this should be pretty simple. Let's take a shot and see how it looks. As you can see, it's pretty much a mirror image of the shot we just did. So I'm going to go ahead and go through the process again, bracketing a mix of ambient and flash to get the perfect look between left and right-hand sides. Okay, so with these 2 shots, again, with the right-hand side and the left-hand side, I think the interior is totally done. What I'm going to do is remove all the flashes, and I'm going to bracket all the way from very far underexposed to get that beautiful blue ocean, all the way to way overexposed to get all of the interior in natural ambient light. You'll see how this kind of looks really unbalanced, but I'm going to brush some of that in to bring back some of the natural feel of this room. So as I'm shooting these brackets, I notice that the background is changing really quickly. There's boats coming in and out, there's people playing volleyball, the beach is full of activity. I'm just going to wait for a minute here and try to find the best, most clean scene to represent that amazing blue ocean. I don't really want too many boats, I don't want jet skiers, I want to keep it calm and tranquil. So I'm just going to take a minute and try to find a nice empty scene that I can composite in to that amazing view. So while this image seems pretty complicated, it's not too bad. It's just really different. We've got maybe 4 or 5 images in post that we're going to have to pull together to make this happen. 1 lighting the left, 1 lighting the right, and I guess 2, 3, maybe 4 ambient images to pull together the entire scene and make it feel natural and flawless. Okay, so we've got everything and I've kind of explained how it works. Let's jump into Photoshop and put it together. So this shot actually took me 2 tries to get it right. The first thing I'm going to do here is I'm going to talk about my failed attempt with this single umbrella. Now, here are a few of the shots from the failed attempt, and I'll explain why these don't work. Now, if you look at the coverage from the umbrella, it doesn't entirely evenly cover the whole ceiling or the whole foreground, or really anything for that matter. It's just like kind of splotchy light here and there. And this is one of the problems that you'll run into. Like if you look back at the hotel images and you don't add some light to the interior to make your compositing life easier, you're going to have a hell of a time getting these all to match up in post after the fact. Now, I thought that maybe because the umbrella was so big and I get such a wide spread that this might work and I could use lighten mode to blend it all together, but it just made it way too difficult, and I couldn't get enough power out of just 1 light to get nice even coverage throughout the entire room. So my attempt to put these together looked like this, and like at first glance, it's passable for a real estate shot or something, but it's kind of muddy and it's really kind of hazy and not that sharp. Like the wood doesn't show up very well. There's this nasty chromatic aberration. There's this, again, like serious muddiness up in the ceiling here. We don't want any of that. So I'm going to jump into Photoshop and just show you why this was such a nightmare to put together. Okay, so here's the file in Photoshop, and I tried to work this through in the hotel while I was hanging out the night after I shot this. And there's just a lot of problems to me, things that really bother me more than perhaps they should, but I'm very much a perfectionist and I want these pictures to be amazing. So let's go ahead and turn off all of our layers and just start down at the bottom here. This is the first shot. I'm actually using my hand to block the flare from the umbrella as I light this right-hand side. And while it looks like we have decent coverage here, all the other little pieces that I had to blend in on top of this start to make things really muddy and hazy, and then I'll start blending this in. You start to see lots of problems like this blown out ceiling where there was a reflection from the flash. And then I tried to kind of clean it up and blend in some ambient over this table. and then I put like an ambient layer over the entire thing at 50% opacity. But then it starts to get muddy. We start to bring in some of that halo around the windows. So I was like, maybe I can fix this with a darker exterior, and I just have to keep going and pen tooling and making more and more work for myself to get subpar results, because again, that spread from the flash was just not enough to cover one half of the room and then the other half at a time. So I had to really cover my tracks with big splotches here and there, and then use ambient layers to kind of hope that I could cover my tracks, but it wasn't good enough. And you can still see there's these like random shadows that don't make any sense down here. Like I showed you in Lightroom, there's this hazy halo and chromatic aberration around everything, and it just feels generally low contrast and pretty flat, and like I didn't quite nail the image, like I didn't quite get it as crisp and as perfect as it should be in real life. So now that we've looked at this, let's go edit the correct, properly created photograph. All right, so let's go back into Lightroom, and just really quickly, I'm going to show you the difference between these exposures with the 4 lights and my exposures with just the 1 light. Now, look how much better that coverage is, especially on this right-hand side here, where there's no blotchiness, the shadows aren't as funky. I mean, there's definitely some shadows, but those will be easy to fix. We have clean interior, we have nice whites here. Look at the difference between this and that really muddy ambient exterior from before. There's no haloing around these wooden beams. There's no haloing around the outside. Everything is sharp and crisp, and it's going to be way, way easier to blend this half with this half to get one really nice looking photo. And as far as the exterior is concerned, because there's no haloing and the flash really cleaned up that interior, it'll be super easy for me to drop in a nice crisp, clean view instead of having to finagle with blending some ambient over here and some ambient over there and some flash over here and just making this kind of blotchy composite. Again, these exposures are much, much cleaner when I used multiple lights with more power than when I used one umbrella with kind of a soft spread that just kind of went on one part of the frame at a time. Okay, so you saw me shoot this. You pretty much know my drill in Lightroom. There's nothing crazy here. I'm just pulling up the shadows, bringing down the highlights, getting as much dynamic range as possible out of these shots. We're gonna go right into Photoshop and start putting this together. So here we are in Photoshop, and I do have the files in front of me. Unfortunately, I was not able to give you guys the files from this lesson because, again, these shots are going to be hopefully published on websites and magazines and all over the place. And it's really important to my client that we control the quality of the images of this project out there in the wild. So I think at this point you'll understand the process even though you won't be working on the files. Many of the techniques are the same that we did in our previous hotel shoots. They're just applied slightly differently. Okay, so here we are in Photoshop, and in my layers panel here, what you see is nothing too unusual. You see the bracketed ambient exposures at the bottom. We have an exposure for the view. We have an exposure for the left-hand side of the room, one that's slightly darker. Again, if you remember, I did play with my aperture and ISO while I was shooting these flash frames so that I could pick and choose the best options for the final image. One more, and then again, same thing on the right-hand side. And again, these are just me sort of playing with the aperture, ISO, and shutter speed to vary the ratio of ambient to flash. I can make the exterior darker and the interior brighter. I can let some more ambient light in to kind of soften that transition between shadow and highlight in those flash frames. So this is just something that I play with to taste. Once I have my lights in the right spot, I will kind of vary the output and power just to make sure I have a couple options when I'm in post and make things a little bit easier to composite together. All right, let's start putting the shot together. What I'm going to do is I'm going to build this on, I think I'm going to build this on this mid-brightness ambient layer. And the first thing I'm going to start with are my flash frames. So I think the middle exposures are probably the best bet. So I'm going to start with the left-hand side. I'm going to Alt-click to add a black layer mask. And using a brush with my opacity at, we'll just go with 50%, I'm going to start painting in those flash frames. And you can see the more I paint this in, the crisper everything sort of gets. You can immediately see that haloing going away outside. And if I leave this sort of half and half here, you'll see on the right we have that extreme dynamic range, too much for the camera to handle, and on the left we have a much cleaner frame. So I'm just going to keep blending those together. And eventually I'm going to go too far to the right and we'll see some weird shadows. We'll see that, like down here in these chairs, there's a bit of funkiness with the shadows going on. And eventually I'm going to hit those lights on the right. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the flash right middle exposure and turn that one on. Alt-click to add a black layer mask, and again, start brushing in the right-hand side to get a nice even exposure throughout this entire interior. Okay, so now that I have my two halves of the scene put together, the next step is to sort of start blending a little bit of ambient light in to make things feel a bit more natural. Now, these ambient frames can be pretty ugly. Again, it's such an extreme dynamic range. What I'll do is I'm just going to start with this middle exposure. I'm going to drag it down to that new layer button there, duplicate it, and like there are some things that I like about this. Some of the more natural shadows, some of the reflections on the chair back. I do like that it's brighter in the foreground rather than having everything lit to the same level, which is going to flatten our picture out. So I want to blend in some of this, but not all. So I'm going to put the blend mode here on luminosity. And obviously that looks pretty goofy as it is. But I'm going to bring the opacity down to like 60 or 50%, somewhere in here. And now look how good, look how natural that wood looks, right? It looks amazing compared to that flashy wood. And I'm going to start painting in with the mask. I'm going to alt-click to add a black layer mask and start painting in some of that natural feel at like 30% opacity on my brush to make this feel much more natural instead of very flashy. And you can see that ceiling looks way better. Like it looks like it's real. It doesn't look so flashy. And I can do the same thing with some of these chairs. I don't want to overdo it because I do like that crispness from the flash. So there's definitely like a happy middle ground. But I think when this picture looks so flashy, you can kind of tell that it's been faked or something. So I just want to gently go in and paint in some of this ambient light. Over here. And I'm being careful not to paint over the exterior because it is blown out, so Photoshop's going to get all confused and it's going to give me that muddy outside. So I don't want to paint over any of this exterior. And keep making my brush a little bigger, sort of blend in some of that flash. I do want some reflections on the table. Again, those reflections and shadows and highlights are going to be what makes this picture feel natural instead of overly flashed. All right, we're looking a bit better here. I want to paint in this overhang out here. I don't like that it's pure white from the flash. I'm going to give that a bit of a more natural feel as well. So I'm just going to use a lasso or a pen tool or whatever's quick here. And bring some natural feel back to this exterior. Okay, so once you have your selection made, you can go ahead and start to brush in some more of that ambient exposure. Again, just trying to keep it a little bit natural rather than super fake looking. And now we, again, go from this really flashy overhang here to something that looks like it has a more natural sort of luminosity pattern to it. Okay, so this is looking much, much better. I'm going to go ahead and clean up my groups here. I'm going to group together these three, and I'll call that blend. Drag it down here. Really, this is only 3 or 4 pictures that have been blended together to make this final shot so far. One thing that does bother me is the brightness of this wooden feature here. I feel like that in real life should be much darker. So I'm going to pen tool, how am I going to do this? I'm going to, again, pen tool this entire area here. This whole interior up to and including these wooden beams. And I'm going to use my dark flash frames to brush back in some shadow. Now you might be thinking, oh, you're crazy, but it's lit so perfectly and yada yada yada. Keep in mind that shadow is what creates depth and mood and texture. And without shadow, the photo is going to look extremely flat. So I want to make sure the things that are facing the camera are in shadow, because the light, the predominant light source, even though we added tons of flash, I still want the predominant light source to be coming from the exterior to keep this photo feeling natural. So everything sort of facing the camera should have a bit more shadow, rather than being very bright and properly exposed like these beams currently are. All right, so we have our selection made. Hit Command Enter and Shift F6 to feather it, and maybe like half pixel this time, because it's so far from the camera, it doesn't take up that many pixels as it is. And I'm going to take these two dark flash frames. I'm going to put them in a new group. I'm going to call that exterior and wooden beams. And I'm going to apply this mask to that group. So anything I do is only going to show up in that area, right? Now I can turn these on one at a time and sort of start adding in some of that more natural shadow. Like that to me already feels much better, like there's much more depth in the photo. Yes, much better. And again, because I'm working in this mask on this group, what I paint back in is only going to affect things within that area. I'll just blend these together. I'm going to make it a little bit darker, so I'll add a curves layer. I don't want to go completely dark and lose the texture of the wood. I'm just kind of eyeballing this so that it looks as it should in real life. Like you should see some color in there, but it shouldn't be this overwhelmingly bright, sort of flat area in the photo. Okay. In hindsight, I probably went a little bit too flashy on this overhang. I'm killing some of that ambient light, so I'm just going to paint that back out. Again, all of this is just to taste. There's no solid rules, but I'm trying to make everything look as natural as I possibly can. There's like a little bit of a shadow from the flash here. See if I can reduce that a little bit. Okay, so something like that. I don't know if you guys think we need to replace this view out here. I think I should definitely clean up all the people. Let's see, if I turn that on, how does it look? I don't think we're gaining anything. I think all I've got to do is get rid of the people outside, and that's not a big problem. So we'll do that right now. I'm going to go ahead and add a new layer and name it Clone. And I'm just going to come in here, make a quick selection around the edge of the pool. And start just taking people's heads and people's bodies out. So just standard clone tool stuff here. Nothing wild. Quick and easy. Much better. Okay, so there's that taken care of. Now the last thing I want to kind of do is I want to darken this a little bit. I don't think it needs to be so bright inside. So I'm going to add a curves layer. I'm going to pull that curve down you guys can see what I'm doing here. I'm going to pull that curve down. Let's see. About there looks pretty good. I'm going to invert that. Take a brush. And I'm just going to start sort of painting in a little bit more darkness where I might expect it to be in real life. Just so this feels like we have a wide range of brightness from the darkest interior to the brightest exterior. And it is okay to let your photos go dark when they are dark inside. But again, you want to keep it somewhat realistic, and it's much darker inside than it is outside. So I'm just kind of adding to that feeling of brightness outside. And I think that's about right. Let's see. Okay. I think that's about looking really good here. What we have, this is actually a reflection of the clouds in the sky. And if I wanted to zap that, I could probably frequency separate that to get rid of it. And that's really the last thing that bugs me here. So I'm going to make a new layer. I can delete the ones that we haven't used. Command-Alt-Shift-D twice. Do a quick frequency separation on this. And that'll be the end. So filter, blur. Throughout much of this tutorial, I've been using the texture layer on our frequency separation, but if I only want to change the color, I don't want to fix the texture, all I need to do is select the color layer in my clone brush and just sample the color. So again, I like this texture, I just much prefer this blue color. So I'm just going to sample the blue and paint it over that white, and we're totally in business. If you wanted to go further with it, you could do it up top here, just to even out the color in this ledge, this overhang, from where we blended back in some of that ambient light. The last thing I'm going to do here is Command-Alt-Shift-E to flatten all to a new layer, and I'm going to drag out some ruler lines, make sure everything is nice and horizontal, and that everything is nice and vertical as well. And it looks like we pretty much nailed this in the field, so I'll go ahead and save that back to Lightroom. Okay, so here we are saved back in Lightroom, and the last things that I'm going to do, I want to crop, I want to get rid of this ceiling. We have a lot of white ceiling up here, which I don't think adds to the photo at all. So I'll go ahead and hit R and crop that. I'm thinking like a 16 by 9, or I still have a little bit there, or maybe a 1 by 2 crop. Might be the way to go, kind of like a nice wide panoramic. Something like that. And then I'm just going to add a little bit of clarity, not that much at all, and just to further kind of move the eye through the frame here, we'll add a little bit of a vignette to keep everything nice and believable. And for the most part, that is kind of a speed edit of the finished shot here. There's some things I might go back in and perfect with cloning and frequency separation, but that's really my secret to getting those impossibly bright spaces to look nice and natural. I know you may not have the luxury of a 2 or 3 day gig like I did on this shoot, but if you have the chance, and I think you should be doing this with all your pictures, you should be constantly looking at what works and what doesn't work so you can improve on it for the next time you shoot. Now, this is one reason why I think shooting tethered in some form is so important, because you can really take a few minutes to look and make sure that everything is going to work perfectly and blend together perfectly, especially when you're going to be doing complicated compositing work in Photoshop after you leave your location. So I'm glad I was able to show you a shot like this, which is honestly a relatively rare scenario, but something you really should be able to nail if you're going to be working in high-end architectural photography. So there's a few more shots from this house that I want to take you behind the scenes and show you. Let's go back on location and check them out.